Hey there, and welcome to Breaking It Down, a podcast from the MS Trust. I'm Nick, and I'm joined by our host, Helena. Hey, Helena.
Hi, Nick. How are you doing?
Yeah, all good, thank you. How are you?
I'm all good. Yes, me and Nick, we both work here at the MS Trust, which is a charity for people affected by MS in the UK. And we're here today to help you make some sense of MS.
That's right, Helena. And the topic this week that we're looking at is MS and work. So, what does that mean for you?
Well, I think, considering that most people that are diagnosed with MS are diagnosed in the sort of peak working age, between 20 and 40, it's going to affect your life a lot, MS in the workplace. And we think it's really, really important to talk about how it might affect you. And also what we want to talk about is to give people some ideas on how to open up and actually talk about how MS would affect you in your place of work.
Absolutely. And to help us out, Helena, we've got 4 guests today. So not just one, but 4.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a jam-packed show.
Yeah.
First up, we've got Dr. Blanca de Dios Pérez. So she is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Nottingham. And she's also at the forefront of research aimed at helping people stay in the workforce when they're living with MS for as long as they wish to. So she's going to be talking to us about what she's found from her latest studies and the things that she hears when she interviews people who live with MS.
And then we're going to be joined by our friends from the organization MS Together, and that's Amy and Sam. This organization is dedicated to supporting young people with MS. So I don't qualify anymore because I'm an old person with MS now. But Amy and Sam will talk about their personal journeys with MS in the workplace, and they'll give us a glimpse into the conversations happening within their community about managing at work.
Yeah, looking forward to that one, Helena. And then finally, we'll hear from Jane. So Jane was diagnosed with MS not too long ago, and she's going to sort of share her story about disclosing her MS at work and some of the challenges that she's faced, but also some of the support that she's received as well.
And as we mentioned at the start, most people, they do receive their MS diagnosis when they're in a working age. And, people that might be looking forward to like a fulfilling career and chances are that these plans may change. Unfortunately, many people with MS decide to stop work earlier than what they wanted to do. And I know this is something that Blanca is going to be talking about in her interview.
Yeah, that's right, Helena. And we're also going to be talking about why that happens. So, some of the symptoms that are most likely to affect people with MS at work, and also what can potentially be done to support people to stay in work as well.
I think we just should kick it off with this Blanca interview because like you said, we have a lot of guests to get through. So we better get working. Over to Blanca and Nick.
Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are joined by Dr. Blanca de Dios Pérez. Hi Blanca, how are you?
Hello, all good, and you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your connection to MS?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham, and I work in the topic of vocational rehabilitation for people with multiple sclerosis, which basically means helping people with MS to remain in paid employment. My background is in psychology, and I have been working with people with MS for the last possibly 10 years on a wide range of topics such as employment, cognition, and word finding difficulties.
We hear from lots of people who are having issues around their working life and MS. Could you tell us from your research sort of what the scale of this is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that, well, there are not two people with MS who are the same, but people with MS tend to experience difficulties remaining at work, and it will vary according to their symptoms, the role, and the support available in their workplace. We know there are 3 main broad categories of issues or difficulties at work. The first one is related to the symptoms. So the presence of symptoms such as fatigue or memory and thinking difficulties can make it difficult for a person to meet their targets, remember deadlines, or complete physical jobs. Then there are also issues with, for example, the environmental factors, which is, for example, the accessibility of the building, the workplace flexibility, or whether the job allows the person to have a flexible schedule, or they might work in work quotas, and that might make it a little bit difficult. And finally, and closely related to the previous one, is related to the area of relationships with your manager or your coworkers. Managers are the key to offering support at work, and they may not understand the mess. They may not be sympathetic of the situation of their employee with MS at work. And it's quite common to have some disagreements with the line manager who may not be providing the support that you need at work because they not quite understand what MS is.
I think that's one of the main things that we hear about from people is that lack of understanding, difficulties with their line manager and not being heard or understood, particularly around things like fatigue, when someone says they're fatigued at work, their manager may have a different understanding of that word than actually, that person who's having MS fatigue and is really, really struggling to complete their tasks on the day. So thank you. And do you know roughly how many people leave work due to MS?
Well, we do not have official numbers of people leaving the workforce prematurely because of MS, but we know that 10 years after the onset of MS, approximately 50% of people with MS remain in employment, and this decreases to 20 to 40% after 15 years. And more specifically, in the context of the UK, we know that 41% of people with MS are in employment compared to 81% of people without MS. And this is a big problem because people are dropping out of work at a relatively young age. But we know that if the work is adapted to meet the needs of the person with MS, most people with MS will be happy to return to paid employment. So we need to do something about enabling them at work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when you share those figures, actually, that really brings it to life, doesn't it? The scale of the issue. You touched on some of these things earlier, Blanca, but what are some of the main MS symptoms that might cause someone to leave work?
Yeah, so well, you've mentioned one of the main ones, which is fatigue. We know that approximately 90% of people with MS mention fatigue as a factor contributing to them leaving the workforce prematurely. Again, people do not understand what fatigue is. They might think, well, I'm tired too, so why don't you take a break? And I'm sure that will help, which is not the case for MS fatigue. And interestingly, with fatigue is that it also worsens other symptoms. For example, memory and thinking difficulties. The more tired you are, the less capable you are to concentrate at work, which is kind of like the next main symptom, the cognitive, so memory and thinking, but also communication skills. People have difficulties concentrating at work, solving complex problems, but also finding words which can make you feel a little bit less confident at work. If you're having a meeting, you need to explain something and the words are not coming, it can be quite challenging at work. Other common symptoms is, for example, mood difficulties, so in particular depression, because of the progression of MS, challenges you are experiencing, not being understood. All of those things can be difficult to adapt to, and people can experience depression, and that can also affect your ability to remain at work. And we know about pain, temperature, so whether the workplace is very hot or very cold, or bowel and bladder difficulties are also some of the frequently reported symptoms that cause difficulties at work. However, they may seem like a long list, but I would like to explain that it is not these symptoms that make the person to leave the workplace. It's the interaction between these symptoms and where you are working and the attitudes of those around you, because many of these symptoms can be managed, or we can lessen the impact through rehabilitation. So not everything is a negative picture. We can do things to manage some of these symptoms at work.
Thank you so much for sharing. And on the subject of the rehabilitation, could you tell us about what vocational rehab is?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there are multiple definitions of vocational rehabilitation, and then they tend to be a little bit vague. Basically, it is whatever helps a person with an illness or a disability to remain, return, or find new employment or other useful occupation. It's basically to enable those who have the ability to work to do so. It's, for example, supporting the person. So in my case, I focus on supporting people to remain in paid employment. And we offer personalized advice and information to help modify the work where you are conducting your duties, and also learn how to self-manage your symptoms. So for example, for some people with MS, vocational rehabilitation may be around supporting them to travel to and from work. So that commute can be quite tiring, and you already reach work already fatigued when you shouldn't be tired when you reach, to be able to perform all your duties, tasks, or meetings. For others, vocational rehabilitation may be around supporting the person to self-manage, for example, their memory and thinking difficulties, with memory aids, splitting tasks, receiving written instructions, for example, or communicating with the line manager so that they can change the way things are done to ensure they can manage MS at work.
Yeah, it sounds like such a flexible approach as well, and allowing people to sort of retain their independence and promote their working life. So Blanca, say someone is working with MS at the moment, when should they start to think about this vocational rehabilitation?
Well, I think from the moment you are diagnosed with MS, it is important to think about your future with MS and work. Um, I People should not be making a radical decision at the point of diagnosis about whether they should drop out of work, because it is a moment of change. It is a difficult time, and things will evolve in the future, and you will become an expert of your own MS. So I think that is the first thing to mention from diagnosis, but don't make a radical decision. Because MS is so different, and everyone with MS as well have very different personal and employment circumstances, we know that some people, at the point that they have been diagnosed, they may have already been experiencing some difficulties at work. We know from research that even, I think it's 5 years before diagnosis, people with MS, before diagnosis of MS, start missing days of work. So, and for that case, those people may already be in need of vocational rehabilitation. For others, the diagnosis might come as a surprise. MS doesn't impact their work performance or productivity, so they don't need to take an immediate action, for example. However, it's important to understand that MS may change in the future. Think about whether you will have, are there any duties or activities that may become difficult in the future, and think about how can we work with the MS and the way we do things at work so that in the future we can extend for as long as possible our productive years.
Yeah, so it's no sort of set time when someone should do it. It's completely up to the individual and the circumstance. And as
Mhm.
you say, it's to promote their working life, to enhance what they're doing, and be able to manage it within their company, their place of work. Yeah. And so, how would someone sort of go about accessing vocational rehab?
This is the biggest barrier, unfortunately, but the access of vocational rehabilitation support in the UK is quite limited and patchy, not only for people with MS, but overall for people with long-term conditions. So there are very few places that offer vocational rehabilitation, and they tend to have very long waiting lists. What we know is that sometimes there may not be a vocational rehabilitation specific service, but through the NHS, you might be referred to an occupational therapist, and that person may have an interest in supporting the person to live well, but they may also have an interest in employment. And then if the person has an employment goal or some challenges at work, we know that occupational therapists are providing some sort of support to self-manage symptoms, communicate with the line manager or co-workers to ensure the person is receiving the reasonable adjustments, which basically are modifications to the work context or duties to overcome the difficulties of MS.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that people can do if they feel that they need some support? Maybe vocational rehab lists are quite long. They may be talking to an occupational therapist as well. Is there anything else that they can do at that stage, Blanca?
So if you cannot access these sort of services and you are aware that you are already experiencing some difficulties at work, I mean, again, it's so different according to the circumstances of the person, but you need to be an expert on your own MS and how it affects you, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. Fatigue is a key factor. So the more you understand how your fatigue works and how it fluctuates throughout the day, you know, what is your best time of the day? If in the morning you are more productive and in the evening you are less productive, so try to change the way you work to do the more complex tasks at the beginning of the day and the less complex at the end. Then there are also national charities that have loads of resources to learn how to self-manage different symptoms, so just reflect on how they are affecting you at work. And for some people with MS, they may have already disclosed their MS, which means they would have told their line manager or human resources that they have MS. You can have an occupational health assessment if you work in a larger organization, and they can offer suggestions and ideas about how to modify your work duties or your environment to manage MS. And if you don't have access to those sort of services, just become familiar with the tools already existing to sort of manage the symptoms and see how they are affecting you at work.
And I guess, as you were saying, you know, it really helps to have that supportive manager, supportive, you know, boss who can work with you with these things. And we know that not everyone is in that situation, right? So that's another challenge. What about if someone hasn't disclosed their MS diagnosis to their line manager, to their HR, to their company at all?
Yeah, that's a very valid point, because it is not necessary for a person to disclose their MS. You will have your reasons for why you will want to disclose or not. But if you have not disclosed because you are concerned or your MS is not having a large impact on your work, just make sure that you monitor the progress and the interaction between your MS and work, because sometimes disclosing at a stage that is too late, it can lead to breaking the relationship with their manager. But if you are confident that you are managing well and have your reasons for not to disclose, just monitor and understand your circumstances and get in contact with organizations that may offer you advice and support on your legal rights or how to self-manage some symptoms to ensure you are still performing in your role.
But for yourself, Blanca, you've obviously done so much research into this topic, but what got you started? Why are you interested in work in MS?
Yeah, so it's not a long story, but yeah, my interest started many years ago when I was studying at the University of Manchester, and I was working on a project understanding word finding difficulties, so anomia in people with MS. And I conducted a brief assessment with over 100 people with MS at Salford Royal NHS Trust. And it was during the Tysabri infusion time, and people are there usually for maybe 1 hour or 2 hours. And I just had plenty of time to get to know the participants, just have a conversation with them, a cup of tea. And I was actually quite interested in knowing whether people could name pictures of objects and how fast they were at naming these pictures, because that was the area I was studying. But in between these assessments, people were telling me their stories of they would had a family, they had, I don't know, they like painting or going for a run. And in particular, one of the recurrent topics was their professional lives. You know, they had completely incredible jobs, you know, from a wide range of areas. So one of them was a personal trainer, there was a lawyer, even a professor. So it was quite interesting that I was quite focused on knowing about how fast they could mention one word of an object, when actually these difficulties could actually have an impact on their professional lives. And it's quite a part of our identity. So reflecting upon those discussions is what made me think about, what is MS and work. Have we looked into that topic together? And I was lucky enough to find a PhD advertised in the University of Nottingham, focused on developing a program to help people with MS to remain in paid employment. And I was successful obtaining it, and I find it's quite an interesting topic because we can all relate to how important our professional lives are, and it has quite a direct impact on people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right. And could you tell us a little bit about your research that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So following from the PhD, where I developed a program, in the previous study, we tested this is a job retention program to help people with MS to remain in paid employment. And we offer support to people with MS and to their line managers if the person with MS agrees to include them. We will not force anyone to include their manager, of course. And the person with MS receives support individualized and tailored to their personal, professional, and MS characteristics. So as I mentioned before, it's quite different. It might be learning more about what MS is or how your fatigue fluctuates throughout the day, identifying changes in the way you work or do things. And in our previous study, we tested within 2 NHS hospitals in Nottingham and Derby. And it was quite a positive experience, the study, because we recruited the number of participants that we wanted to recruit. Participants at the end of the study reported that the support they received helped them achieve their employment goals, which is quite an important area of change for us to see. And we were not in a position to move forward to a larger study in the NHS because due to the long waiting lists, lack of staff, also healthcare appointments are quite short, and we see there is a mismatch between the views of people with MS on the healthcare appointments. So the NHS is there to take care of my health, but not take care of my employment. And that's what led to the next study, that what we see is that people with MS, very soon after having been diagnosed with MS, they contact MS charities for advice and information, and they are seen as a wider organization that you can go for information about your treatments, but also your family life, your professional life. So we are now interested in seeing how MS charities in the UK can offer support with employment to people with MS. And hopefully we can find people soon after they have been diagnosed, before the problems are more complex or difficult, to ensure they can receive support in a timely manner.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. That's incredible, some of the results that you're talking about there. And actually, with the scale of the issue that we've discussed as well, it's so important, isn't it? In an ideal world, Blanca, what would you like to achieve from all of your research into this subject?
Well, my ideal goal will be to have access, to ensure that people with MS have access to vocational rehabilitation services from the point of diagnosis. That would be ideal, either from NHS or MS charities. I think there is a potential of collaboration of both of them to target different needs according to the stage of the person's life. And as we evolve and understand more this topic, the support should be expanded not only to job retention, but to help people back into the workforce, from education into employment. So even from like how to progress, for how to put yourself forward for promotion or change roles, that sometimes people feel quite limited and concerned about moving to a different role just in case they will not accommodate their MS. So I would like it if it could be more comprehensive, the support available for employment for people with MS in the UK.
Amazing. I think that would be amazing, wouldn't it, if we could get to that point? So it's just so many challenges to navigate. But yeah, no, it's so important, isn't it? And obviously you mentioned MS charities, and we're very lucky to be able to do some work with you as well. Could you tell us about what you've been doing with the MS Trust helpline?
Absolutely. So yeah, the MS Trust is a partner for my next study. I have recruited 4 different MS charities to participate in this study. And the idea is that the program that we have tested in the NHS, it was meant to be delivered by an occupational therapist or a psychologist. But what I'm currently doing is I am mapping and understanding the services currently offered by MS Charities in the UK, adapting the current program of support and developing a training program so that people from MS Charities, for example, helpline officers or people who are already engaged in offering advice day to day to people with MS, so that we can offer a personalized package of support through the helplines. And the MS Trust is one of the organizations. So we are in the stage of adapting the current materials that we have. And in early 2025, I will recruit and train professionals from the MS Trust. And hopefully from May, we will be recruiting normal people who are accessing the helpline of the MS Trust, so that they can receive employment support to help them to remain at work. It will be a small feasibility study because this is the first time that this has been done. We are unsure of whether it will work. So we want to see on a first level, what are the current skills, how can we upskill the staff, and what are the questions that come through the helpline, and how can we help people. So if everything works well, this study could be the next step towards understanding how to expand the provision of these services using MS Charities.
It's fantastic. It's amazing. As I say, we're really, really lucky to work with you, and we're hoping that we can push forwards as much as we can as well and support the MS community. Well, Blanca, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you talking to us and all of your support. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and it was lovely having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for everything.
Now, if this was a commercial podcast, here is where there would be an advert. You know this by now. We don't do that because we're a charity. So instead, we'd like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the resources that we have for people with MS.
Yeah, and Helena, a great place to start is our website. So that's mstrust.org.uk. And on there, we've got lots of information for anyone whose life is impacted by MS. So if you head to the A to Z section of our website and you find W for work, there you'll find lots of information about work and study, your rights, and what you can do to support yourself at work. We also have a previous podcast where we looked much more at rights and work. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
And now over to Amy and Sam and MS Together.
Hello and welcome back. So we are joined by Amy and Sam from MS Together. How are you doing?
Good, yeah, good, thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Just before we get into our topic of work and MS, could you just tell us about yourself? So as you're first on my screen, Amy, if we could go with you first.
Yeah, of course. So I am Amy. I was diagnosed with MS back in 2018, just after my 21st birthday. I'm also the CEO and founder of the charity MS Together, which I founded a few years after my diagnosis. But yeah, it all started because I basically felt like there was a bit of a gap in the services that existed for younger people living with MS.
Amazing, thank you. And over to you, Sam.
Yeah, so I was diagnosed 9 years ago now. That just makes me feel so old. In 2015, I think when I was, that works. I was 24. And I work full-time still in the finance sector, but I also volunteer and I'm a trustee for MS Together, and I've been volunteering for MS Together for the last sort of few years now.
Amazing, incredible. And for anyone who's sort of not familiar with MS Together, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Yeah, of course. So as I said, MS Together was set up kind of back in 2019. It started with a handful of people. And as I said, it was because I felt that there was a real gap that existed for younger people back then. And we registered as a charity in 2022, at the end of 2022. So it's been quite a long journey. up until that point. But since then, we've received some funding to do some amazing projects and just kind of grow the charity. So our main support offerings are online support networks. So they're hosted on WhatsApp and Facebook, and they're focused on providing support for people aged 18 to 35 living with MS in the UK and Ireland. We organise lots of different events, so virtual events, informative webinars, in-person events as well at different locations across the UK. And then we've also got a number of support services as well, some that are open to anyone affected by MS and some that are again more focused on people aged 18 to 35. So that includes a peer-to-peer support service and a pilot counselling service as well.
Wow, incredible. It's so much in such a short space of time as well. It's been, amazing to see that journey as well. And Sam, what do you do for MS Together in your voluntary role?
Yeah, so when I first found MS Together, I was very much came into it as a community member, using it, because like Amy said, there was such a gap. I remember when I was diagnosed at 24 and just looking online for people that I could relate to, and I found a blog from someone that was young, and that was it, and it was weirdly similar to my story. I could have written it myself. So when I found, so I was diagnosed a lot, it was a time before then I found MS Together, so I just sort of started using the services and joining in with the community and things, and then gradually I sort of started helping out with online presence, social media side of things, and just kind of taking it from there, really.
Sam is definitely underselling herself there. She does so much.
I kind of just do a bit of whatever's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's incredible. Yeah, it's often the way, isn't it? People say, I do a bit of that.
Just a little bit of that.
Obviously, with this episode, we're talking quite a lot about work and MS. And before we find out a little bit more about sort of your community and some of the challenges that they've faced, I was wondering if we could hear from both of you from sort of your experiences of being a young person and working with MS. So I don't know, Amy, could we hear from you first?
Yeah, of course. So I was diagnosed at university. So I was in my third year of university, and I'd had part-time jobs since having MS, but obviously nothing that was full-time, where I might need any kind of reasonable adjustments. And I went into my first job, and it was a retail job. So I was on my feet every day, all day. And I genuinely didn't know that there were kind of things in place that could help support me. Like my manager at the time, I did really like them, but they never kind of spoke to me about options. They never really checked in on if I was doing okay. And I think that maybe is a retail thing. I think, when you have an office job, it is potentially a bit easier to get those reasonable adjustments in place. Not that it should be like that, but I think, sometimes that might happen. So that was my first experience. And then basically from then, it was COVID, and I went from that to just working at home all the time. So I think, working from home is a reasonable, I can't say reasonable adjustment. Working from home is a reasonable adjustment in itself in some ways, because obviously, you don't have the commute time. You save a lot of energy from that in itself. Again, you don't have to be on your feet. You can rest when you need to. You can take breaks when you need to. So yeah, I think that's something that's definitely helped me. But that's just what my life is like now. I've worked from home ever since. But then I have had jobs prior to working for MS Together, where I've benefited from things like flexible hours, again, remote working. What else? Reducing my hours on certain days, and also one thing that really benefited me was actually condensing my hours. So I did 5 days worth of work in 4 days, but it meant I got the 5th day off. And although it was, you know, quite long hours, it definitely really did help having that extra day just to rest and do all the things that I didn't have the energy to do, you know, if I only had 2 days at the weekend, for example. So yeah, those are just some of the things that have helped.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your journey. And was that exhausting, doing that 4 days, you know, all in one go?
It was, but I think because I was working from home, and like I was saying, you know, you can put in those additional breaks, you can kind of split up your work to fit around you, and as long as the work gets done, my manager, you know, was kind of happy with that. So I feel like I definitely would have struggled, you know, if I was going into an office doing 4 days a week, 5 days over 4 days in an office. But because I was at home, I think it was definitely more manageable, and something that I think a lot of people probably could benefit from. And I think some people, again, do 9 days in 10. Is it 9 days in 10? So then they get every other day off. So there's lots of ways you can do it. But yeah, I've just found having that extra day to just get like all your admin done, get like, you know, the things that you don't really want to be doing at the weekend. I find that super helpful. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I was wondering if you had any experiences to share, Sam.
Yeah, so I was really lucky. When I was diagnosed, I really got along with a manager. Like, they were really good. I actually rang them from hospital.
Wow.
Because it was so new to me, and I was off work and I was like, oh my God, I've got MS. So my poor manager was probably like, I don't really know what to do with that information. But yeah, I've had, because I work in like with the corporate company, like anything, different teams, I've had different managers along the way. So I've kind of built up a bit of experience on like disclosing my MS, talking to them about my needs and things. And I'm sure like a lot of people can relate to, I've had good experiences with that, and I've had probably not so great experiences. A lot of that does come from the fact that I've always tried to be like, no, I don't need any, like, obviously there's been adaptions and stuff, but in terms of like targets and the workload that you're sort of expected to produce, I've always tried to be like, no, like I can match that, I can do it, it's fine. So it's really, I think, about keeping an open communication with managers, because then the good ones have kind of built a safe space for me to say, actually, I think I need a little bit more time with this, or breaks or whatever. Whereas like the more negative experiences I've had are then like, well, you didn't meet X, Y, and Z, you know, and there's no sort of like, what's the word? There's no sort of like where compassion of them being like, okay, there's probably a reason for that. And that has kind of like pushed me to change career paths in a way. But I always look at it as a positive, because when I was, I keep going to say, but I don't think I should say where I work. When I was like,
we won't be liable for anything.
But yeah, I was heading down one career path with the company I work for, and I was very set pre-diagnosis on, this is what I want for my life. And being diagnosed, it kind of like made me reevaluate things, and I did make a change on what that would look like for the better. Like, that's my takeaway from it, that even though I didn't pursue what I had originally wanted, I'm now a million times happier with it. And I do work from home as well, but I did pre-COVID, so I'd kind of already kind of got used to it. And I think if anything, COVID did show employers that working from home adaptation can be done. I think there was a lot of fear around it, but now it just shows it does work.
Absolutely. And, you know, supporting people
who maybe
live with MS, but also, you know, in terms of supporting other, you know, people who are to be productive as well. So
even family, like with school runs.
Through MS Together, you've been sort of focusing on work and MS through some of your social media posts, some of your recent activities. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, what you hear from your community at MS Together. What are some of the challenges that people are facing? So I was wondering if you could shed a little bit more light on that, and that can be for either Amy or Sam.
Yeah. I'll jump in. So yeah, like you said, we decided to do a focus on work and MS for September, and it's kind of carrying on into October, which is nice. So yeah, it's basically because we've seen lots of different conversations in our support groups and just in the community in general about people having problems at work, you know, having employment concerns, and coming to the community for, you know, answers to those questions. And really, those answers should already be out there, because, you know, there's a lot of people dealing with MS or another disability that need additional support, and they need to know where they can find that. So I guess that's one of the reasons why we wanted to raise awareness of some of the challenges that people have at work. So whether that's, you know, dealing with symptoms, so, you know, fatigue, cognitive impairment, physical limitations, having a relapse, or even like mental health. Or it could be job security and discrimination. Unfortunately, we have seen a lot of people talking about that as well. There's also financial strain. So, you know, people worrying about reducing their hours or leaving work, even though that would be beneficial to their health if they did that. And then also, you know, finding their first job, like I was talking about, like finding your first job after university. You know, a lot of people in our community are younger, and they might be, you know, have got that diagnosis and then trying to find their way in the kind of world of work, or even people changing jobs and kind of navigating that. And then I think what comes with that is disclosing your condition, and that's always a massive topic. I can see Sam nodding, like, you know, whether you disclose before the job interview, during the job interview, after you've got the job, whether you disclose at all, whether you disclose to just the employer or you know, your colleagues or both, and also how you do that. And I think there's so many questions when it comes to what's right and what's wrong, and I think there isn't really a right and wrong, but it's always beneficial to see success stories and hear other people's experiences, because, you know, if we and that's what we wanted to do. I think we wanted to share information around things like access to work, things that might benefit people, so reasonable adjustments, and then also success stories from people that have had good experiences in the workplace. Because, you know, if you do hear of someone having a positive experience about changing their hours or telling their employer, or an employer having really good communication with you, then it might make you feel a bit better about bringing up some of those concerns at work, or just having that information of knowing where you can go to get that information and support, even if that's not from your employer. So yeah, I think that's why we wanted to do it. It's what we've tried to do last month. And yeah, like I said, we're going to bring it into this month as well and try and keep the conversation going, because there's definitely, you know, more that we can share. And we also did a webinar on employment and MS as well, which is on our YouTube channel. So that just, again, gives people a lot of information and kind of signposting support to different things that might benefit them.
Amazing, incredible. So you've got like the, you know, the stories from the community, you've got information to support people, you've got that peer-to-peer support as well, which is so important, isn't it? So thank you so much for sharing. And if anyone's listening to this who does want to find out more about MS Together or get involved in what you do, where's the best place to find out more?
So you can find us on a few different social media places. Obviously, there's our private Facebook group for people officially diagnosed 18 to 35. We're on Instagram, we're on TikTok, and you can find, especially on Instagram and TikTok, there's like links in the bio with everything, like all our events and stuff. We have our webpage. There's loads of ways to reach out to us.
Amazing, incredible. We'll make sure that we link down in the show notes as well to where people can find MS Together, and also link to maybe to the work webinar as well if anyone wants to go back and listen to that one. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you both so much, Amy and Sam. Really appreciate you sharing your experiences and also what you're doing with MS Together. So that's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this podcast from the MS Trust. As we mentioned previously, we don't have any adverts in our podcast, and this is due to the fact that we are a charity. We don't receive any NHS or government funding. but the work that we do is vital. We help to train new specialist MS health professionals like MS nurses and therapists who work in MS. And also we fund new MS nurses in the NHS workforce as well. We also produce lots of vital information for people living with MS to help support them to live their best life possible. We also have our free confidential helpline that's open to anyone who can call in the UK to help make sense of MS. None of this would be possible without the generosity of our donors. So if you would like to leave us a donation to help the vital work that we do, we'd be really, really grateful. Head over to our website and find the donate section. We'll also link this down in the show notes. Thank you.
I am here now with Jane. Hi, Jane.
Hello. Hi, Helena. Nice to meet you.
And we're going to be talking a little bit about what it's like to have MS and go to work, and how you can sort of approach the subject of having MS at work. But before we start, Jane, do you mind telling us a little bit about who you are and maybe about your MS journey so far and your diagnosis?
Of course. Yes. So my name's Jane Webber. I'm 52 and I was diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS last year in April 2023. I started disease modifying therapy treatment in May this year, and I've opted for Ocrevus 6-monthly infusions. So I'm just sort of at the beginning of that journey in terms of treatment. So obviously, as you will probably know from your experience with MS, it's quite a roller coaster. And just sort of getting to know what the disease is all about, understanding your symptoms and how to manage them is quite a big mountain to climb.
And had you had symptoms for a long time before you were diagnosed? Because you're very new into the journey, really.
Yes. So I started off with symptoms back in January last year. And the symptoms I started off with was just numbness in my toes, and then that progressed into my feet, up to my lower legs, and then all the way up to my legs completely on both sides. And at first I'd been out in the cold, so I thought, I've just got a bit chilly, and my circulation's just a little bit out of sorts, and I was expecting that sort of numbness to disappear, and then it kind of carried on. And I described the sort of sensation to my husband as I felt like I was walking on sponges. Because I just had that numbness in my feet and my toes, etc. So obviously I went to my GP, and they weren't sure what it might be. So they said, well, it might be this, it might be that. Obviously, it's very difficult to diagnose. So then I sort of carried on and just was hoping that the symptoms would disappear. They still continued. And as I say, by this time it had tracked up to both my legs. So I went back to the GP again. They started to talk about being referred to a neurologist. So I got a referral for that, and then ended up having an MRI scan. But to be honest, MS never crossed my mind whatsoever. I really thought the neurologist would tell me that I had perhaps a trapped nerve in my back or something. So when I went back for the appointment, which was in April, and he gave me the diagnosis, to say I was absolutely blown away was an understatement. It was just that word, and it obviously makes you feel very scared, because I didn't know a lot about MS until that moment. Obviously I'd heard of it, but I didn't understand what that meant and how it could manifest and how long that condition will last for, etc. So obviously that sort of hearing that first word makes you suddenly say, oh my goodness, and then you need to then go and find out a lot of information. And obviously we're all very guilty of going on to Google, but it's things like the MS Trust that I did turn to for obviously correct information that I could find useful, and I did find a lot of the leaflets very, very helpful to give me that sort of information that I needed, that very clear, concise information about what the disease was, how it could progress, what the symptoms are, etc., etc. And it was really, really useful to have that information.
Oh, that's really good to know. Yes, because like you say, everybody jumps on Google, and
Yes.
you can be really unlucky if you go down a hole of finding all
Yes.
kinds of crazy information there. So yes, good.
Yeah.
Very happy that you found us.
Yes, thank you.
So you said you didn't know so much about MS before. Had you ever met people with MS before?
No, I hadn't. So it's that sort of, unknown, isn't it? And I think being able to sort of hear stories from people is really helpful and really powerful.
Yeah.
And just understanding how other people manage their MS and how they live with it. And then also, when you think about the Paralympics, it's just taken place, seeing how people like athletes like Kadina Cox have taken control of their MS and gone on to achieve amazing things. And that gives you that kind of confidence that actually it's not an awful sentence. There are ways and means of living and managing with your MS. And I think that's important to take that away. But on the flip side, there is that obviously dark period that I think you go through when you have a diagnosis such as this, where you've got to get your head around it all, haven't you, and understand what it means and do your research, but also I think almost allow yourself a bit of a grief period, because you had life before and now life after, and understanding that you've got to kind of come to terms with that as a person, and with your family and with your friends, etc. But I think it's just a very personal journey you have to go on to sort of get yourself in that position where you say, right, I've got MS now, so I need to deal with it. But it's very different, and a very different cycle for everybody in terms of how you come to terms with that. I'm sure it's very individual.
I think you're correct, because I think even if you had known someone with MS, it doesn't mean that their person's journey would be anywhere where your MS is manifesting, because it's all very different from person to person. So sometimes it can be useful to know people, and then other times it's not. I remember when I was diagnosed, my mum was comparing me to the two people that she knew with MS, and their MS was completely different from how mine has been. So it can be useful, can also be not always useful. So day to day now, what are the symptoms that you live with now? Because you said you're on disease modifying treatment as well.
Yes. So I think the worst symptom for me is the fatigue, and I think it's very difficult to explain to people what that means who don't know, who haven't got MS or haven't experienced severe fatigue, because fatigue in some respects I don't think captures it as a word. It's I don't know. I guess it is. That's the explanation for it. But I just think in terms of how it makes you feel and the impact on your life is very, very different. I mean, in terms of mobility, my mobility is fine. I sometimes have moments where I have a bit of a weakness in one of my legs, and sometimes I have a bit of a foot drop and sort of dragging leg moment. But that happens very infrequently, and it doesn't stop me from doing anything. But I would say the fatigue is the big thing for me. Because I try to get out and be active, but to be honest, I work full time, and by the time I finished work, I'm absolutely exhausted. So it's enough to kind of just think about preparing a meal and then just having some quiet time. So all my intentions of getting up early and doing things don't happen because I'm just too tired.
Yeah, it's not easy to find that sort of balance, is it?
Yeah.
But yes, fatigue. I mean, it's such a massive, big problem within the world of MS. And as we're talking about work today, how does the fatigue affect you at work?
So I don't think it affects me in terms of, I have my set hours. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I'm predominantly based from home, so I don't have that horrendous commute to an office. So that's very beneficial, actually. And so that makes life easy for me in terms of I haven't got an hour commute in the car, etc., or on public transport. But in terms of work, I think I've kind of taken the approach that it's business as usual with my home and my work life with MS. And I'm trying not to affect it and make me change things too much unless I have to, obviously. So my approach has very much been business as usual, carry on. But I think I do now. I'm sort of over a year since my diagnosis, I'm now learning that I need to be a bit kinder to myself in terms of time management. I'm not overcommitting myself to things. But it's a very fine balance, isn't it? Because you still want to live a normal, full life. But I think you've just got to be mindful that you need to be aware of that fatigue and how it can creep up on you.
I think it's quite common also that if we're having a good day, you push on and do extra. And you go, well, I'll finish this because I'm feeling good now. And then the day after, you're feeling the drain because clearly that pushing was pushing a bit too much.
Yes, definitely.
And that can, it comes back and bites you a little bit sometimes.
Yes.
But like you said, it's tricky to find the balance.
Yes,
so when you were diagnosed, what were you thinking about talking to your employer about your MS? Did you tell them straight away or what?
Yes, I did, because obviously there's a lot of appointments that start to happen afterwards, isn't there? So I was aware that I may have to have appointments inside work hours, and I obviously just wanted to be clear and transparent about that. So I spoke to my HR business partner and also my line manager and told them about it. And they were very, very supportive and very, very helpful, and asked me if there was any adjustments that I needed to make, etc. So, and it was just really nice to have had that conversation and know that support was there. And they are very supportive of me moving forwards. So that was the sort of initial people that I told. I didn't tell any other colleagues until quite a bit later on, because I think having just got over that diagnosis and told who my immediate line manager about it, I kind of wanted to come to terms with it myself and understand how life was going to look with MS moving forwards. And it was a while before I told my immediate family as well, because again, I just wanted to have an understanding of it myself and kind of know how it was going to plan out in terms of treatment, etc. And obviously there's a waiting time period to get yourself on the waiting list for treatment, etc. So it was quite a bit later before I told my family, because I wanted to be in a position where I was armed with the information about what was going to happen next, because I knew that would be the questions that they'd want to know. And then I told my wider team earlier this year, probably in about March time, and it was quite cathartic to tell them about it. And again, so very, very supportive, lots of kind messages and offers of help if I needed it, and just support in terms of saying, well done for sharing it, and it was just really nice to have that support from the team. And then that led me on to wanting to write a post for our internal company intranet about living with MS, and I did that around MS Awareness Week.
Oh, yes.
So I actually shared my MS journey with the wider business. And again, that was received very well. And I had lots of nice comments from people on that. And I think, again, it's just an opportunity to be able to spread that awareness, because like people prior to me being diagnosed, I didn't know a lot about the disease. So, it's sort of arming people with that further information about the disease.
And when you started talking about MS, were there a lot of people that sort of say, oh, I know someone with MS? Or,
yes, there were. And there was a colleague that is also, not somebody that I work closely with, but somebody within the business that does also have MS. And through me sharing my experiences, they felt able to talk about their journey as well, which was really helpful and really, really important and powerful. And they felt a lot of benefit from doing that. And then there are some other colleagues who've mentioned that they've got relatives with MS. And when I talked about doing this volunteering with the trust today, other colleagues have said, oh, can you put me in touch, because I'd like to do something. So hopefully there'll be some more volunteers coming your way on the back of that, which is really good.
Oh, that we love that. that's really nice. No, but it is, because MS is, quite common. It is quite often that, if you know someone, they know someone, and then you get quite surprised how small the world can be sometimes. But I think it really is nice especially for your colleague that had maybe not talked about MS before, and then see you do it and then feel empowered to do it themselves.
Yes, yeah.
And so you said there was fatigue that you generally deal with at work. Is there, and you're mostly doing business as usual, but say that you would have a day where you would be very fatigued. Is there anything that you would do differently from how you used to work before?
Not at the moment. I think I'm managing it fairly well, but obviously I think if things were to change, then I would perhaps, speak to my employer about maybe changing my hours to fit around those fatigue peaks and troughs. because it's just that unknown, isn't it? You don't know that on Monday you're going to feel particularly tired, or Wednesday you're going to feel particularly tired. It's just that real unknown, isn't it? But I know from the conversations I've had with my employer that they would be fully supportive if I did need to say, do you know what, I just need a few hours quiet time this afternoon, and perhaps not be involved in a lot of meetings, and just, concentrate on something that's less stressful, for example, in the afternoon or something. So I know that they would be fully supportive if I requested that.
So especially now when you shared with the rest of your team as well what's sort of going on, I guess it helps, doesn't it? Because there's a lot of people that stay quiet about their MS at work. But if you are struggling, people start sort of wondering, don't they? And they go, "Oh, what's happening here?" And
yes.
So I guess it's for you. I guess you feel that it's been very beneficial for you to sort of come out as such.
Yes, no, definitely, and I think exactly that, because if you are having not a particularly good day, it's nice to know that your colleagues understand why you're perhaps not having a good day, without you having to say, "Oh, I'm having a bad day because." But then I suppose it's always good to remind people as well, because I guess because on the outside you probably look fine and normal, sometimes it's probably not a bad thing to actually say, "Do you know what, I'm having a particularly bad week this week, so bear with me," sort of thing. But it's difficult. I think you've got to go with what works with you as a person and what you feel comfortable with. And as you say, not everybody wants to talk about it with their employer. They want to keep that very separate, and I think it's just a very individual choice as to whether you are open and honest or you choose not to be.
That's very true. When you sat down with your employer and told them about MS, how did you explain MS? Did you sort of come armed with information, or?
Probably yes. I think, as I say, I'd received quite a lot of leaflets from the trust, which I found really useful, because and when I particularly wrote the blog post for our company intranet, I found that a really good, useful source to actually explain what it is. And yes, when I talked to my colleagues as a team as a whole, I did use a lot of that information to talk about what is MS, explaining that it's a neurological disease, what the impact of it is, how it manifests, etc., and just to explain that. And I think that's just really useful to kind of put it into context, because people will have probably heard of the illness, but they don't actually know what that means on a day-to-day basis. So it was powerful for me to be armed with that information, to be able to share that.
And sometimes we hear, and I know I've felt it certainly, that MS can sort of impact a little bit on confidence at work, because you might have a big project that's coming up and you feel like, "Oh, am I going to be able to keep on working this hard, or if the stress level is going to be too much?" Have you felt that, or have you got any tips for people who are dealing with things like this? Because this is something comes up often.
I think from my own point of view, I will call it out and say I'm having a brain fog moment, and that can be attributed to MS or menopause, because I'm perimenopausal, so I've got that going on as well. But I think I feel confident to be able to say, because quite often you're having a conversation and then my mind will just go completely blank. And I know what I wanted to say, and it was literally there, and then I forget. So I'm quite confident to actually say, "Oh, bear with me, I'm having a brain fog moment." And I think, but again, as I said before, that's very individual as to what you feel comfortable with. But personally, I do. So I'm happy to sort of talk about that and say that. And as I say, I work with an amazing team of people, and they're really, really supportive and kind and caring. So I don't feel embarrassed to say that. And I think that's really helped me, to be honest, so that I can actually be quite honest and say, and as I say, it's my brain fog moments. They happen quite often, unfortunately.
Same. It is as well. I'm also hitting that perimenopausal part, and it is the funny brain fog, isn't it? Because it almost feels sometimes you can see the word in front of you, but you just can't. You can't grasp it.
Yes, yeah, and it's frustrating, isn't it? Because you look back on your well even last week and you think I'm a confident person, I'm intelligent, I'm good at my job, but all of a sudden I can't remember something that I was about to say that was really important and would have added to this meeting, and you just have to take a breath and think it'll come back in a minute.
Yeah. So Jane, if somebody who listens to this is newly diagnosed with MS, perhaps they're at work, they're thinking of maybe talking to their team or reaching out to their employer, what sort of advice would you give the person who is in that situation now?
I think what worked really well for me was having that information and that the explanation of what the illness is. So to be able to actually describe what MS is, what the complications can be, what the implications are, and also to be able to talk about my own journey in terms of my treatment plan as well. And I just think it's just being armed with that information and feeling confident to talk about it. And as I said before, I think it's very individual as to whether you do want to bring your MS to work, because some people might not want to. And I guess it depends on the environment you work in, your team, your employer, etc. But it would be nice to think that everybody would feel confident to bring it to MS bring their MS to work, because why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
But I can understand that it's a very individual thing. And I think you've just got to be confident to be able to have that conversation, but then understand that you are well within your rights to have that conversation as well, and ask for reasonable adjustments should you need them.
Yeah.
And your employer should obviously help you to achieve that. And I think as well, it's I guess you've got to sort of think that it's not the end of your working life career. I guess having sort of quite a diagnosis such as this, you might think that's it. My life's going to change completely. And I think it's just taking a moment to kind of understand how life is going to look for you moving forwards, but then don't think that it's game over sort of thing, because it's not by any means. But obviously it's that whole journey going on, I think, and just getting your head around it all and then feeling confident.
I really love that you wrote the blog post as well, because sometimes writing things can be easier than to stand up and talk.
Definitely.
As well.
Yes, definitely. And it was very useful, and then that helped me frame the conversations. I wrote it before I spoke to my team, but I hadn't published it at that stage. But it helped me frame that conversation I was going to have with my wider team, and then having that sort of written down. And as you say, my colleague that also joined me in the blog post, described it as being very cathartic, and I know exactly what she means, because actually letting it all out and putting it on paper was very, very, very useful and very, very beneficial. And perhaps that would be my advice to people, that if you are thinking about having that conversation with the employer, perhaps write it all down first, so that you've got that to refer to, and it gives you that kind of reference point should you need to refer back to the points you wanted to make before that conversation.
And finally, before I let you go and get on with your day, you were talking about cog fog. Now, that is one of the things that I struggle with as well. Have you got any tips for when you're dealing with that at work?
So, well, as I say, it's one of those things. I'm happy to call it out in a meeting when I'm having a foggy moment. I mean, I'm a copious note writer, so I'm always writing notes, and that helps me as well to refer back. And obviously with the digital age we're in now, meetings can be recorded if you feel that a meeting should be recorded, etc. And that's useful if you wanted to play some things back. But as I say, I've always got a notebook, pen and paper to hand, and I just find that really useful to make notes throughout the meeting, highlight the important points, and then I can review those at the end of the session and make sure that I've got my action list ready. So that helps me, I must admit. But then there are those moments when you think, right, I'll do that next. Then you get swamped into something else and you forget about the thing that you were going to do.
Yeah, that's very true.
And I have suddenly one of those, I needed to do so and so, and then I have to go back to my notes, but then I can find what I've got to do. But I think, again, with digital age, you can make notes, on a digital notepad and make some notes on your Teams meeting, etc. So you've got something to point to. But I think the more you can help yourself by making notes, that just works personally very well for me.
That's brilliant advice. Thank you so much, Jane. This
No
has been
problem.
really interesting. And thank you so much for volunteering with
No,
us as
thank
well.
you very much. I'm glad to be able to help.
So, lots to go through today. I love hearing stories about when things go well at work, and to see people who have had positive changes. I have worked for the MS Trust for many, many years now, and I've heard some horror stories where people really, have been up against it, and all these people that have had to leave work really early. Well, not really early as in, leaving at 2:00 instead of 5:00, but you know what I mean. I'm getting the cog fog moment now. And I do think, you spend so much time talking about it but I do think it is really, really important to open up about it. I mean, I'm really spoiled because I work for an MS organization, so most people know all the symptoms that's going on. We've just working, you and me together, where we obviously made some changes for this podcast. Like, we tend to record this podcast earlier in the day rather than at 4:00, as we tried that, and that didn't really work out so well. So I think, being open and honest about it has certainly really helped me. But I do know that it can be a tricky situation to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think listening to Blanca, some of the statistics were shocking. The amount of people who want to work and want to stay in work, but actually they can't, because of the situation, because of the demands of the job that they're in. And I think there's a long way to go, isn't there, for people to be supported to stay in work for as long as they feel that they can. I think that's important to note as well. But yeah, I think you're right, Helena, as well. We've heard from so many people on our social media, on the helpline, who are just having a really, really difficult time at work. And I think the further that we can go as a society to support people to work and to make reasonable adjustments, it's not the 1980s anymore. It's we've got remote work, we've got jobs that can be done with reasonable adjustments now, and there's still so much value that people with disabilities can bring to the workforce, and a great perspective as well, and insight and compassion and all of those things.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, after COVID, things have really revolutionized the world that we live in when it comes to work, because like working from home is not that frowned upon. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I wasn't working for the MS Trust then, and the company that I worked for, they did actually offer me to work from home, but that was in 2007, so that was quite rare back in those days. But it really did make a huge big difference for me, because I used to commute all the way into London back and forth. So I used to be absolutely shattered by the time I got into the office. So I do think, like, opening up and talking about it, and I think it's really important to sort of say that's because I know people can feel, and I certainly have felt like that you're sharing weaknesses. You don't want to be seen as a weak employee and somebody that need extra attention and all these things. But actually, it will just make you a better employee, because you've been hired to do a job, and they've hired you because you have these skills, and they should value those skills and try to really help you do the best what you can. And I feel like hopefully that's the best of all worlds. We know we still have a far way to go, but I think things like vocational rehab is really interesting to hear about, because it's clearly making a difference.
Absolutely. And I think to value you as a person as well, not just your skills, and actually to value workplace culture. Because, do any of us really want to work for an employer who pushes people out because they've got a disability? Absolutely not.
No, exactly. And I think this is something that people have gotten more aware of in the world now. It's not just about, like, work hard, play hard, that sort of mentality. We all as a society been encouraged to look after our mental health and things like that. So I think, there are baby steps that are being taken. And I think that's really, really great. I think, opening up and talking about them as at work, sometimes you can worry a little bit about that people will just think your whole personality is MS. Sometimes I find it hard to know where MS stops and Helena's, starts. But I think that's a whole different podcast on that topic. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that, don't forget that even if you have MS and talking about it at work, that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that you just become the condition that you are.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true, Helena. And if you do have any questions about MS and work, or questions relating to MS in general, we are here for you. We have our helpline service, which is available Monday to Friday. That's apart from UK bank holidays, and that's 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Outside of those hours, you can, of course, leave us a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So you can ring the free helpline. That's 0800 032 039 039. If you'd rather not speak to someone on the phone, but you still have a question that you'd like our helpline service to answer, you can email us. That's ask@mstrust.org.uk. And we will, of course, link to all of this information in the show notes.
And you can also come and talk to us on social media. We are in the usual places. We are on Facebook, YouTube, X, TikTok, and Instagram. You can find this podcast on places where you would normally listen to your podcasts, like Apple Podcast and Spotify, YouTube Music. And we love it when you get in touch, leave us a comment, give us a review, tell us what you think of this episode, maybe share some of your work stories. Have you had good experiences? Have you had bad experiences? Have you maybe done something that you felt like, actually, this was made a big change for me, and would like to share it with other people? Do get in touch. You can also email us at comms@mstrust.org.uk.